Roman generals almost never charge with the cavalry. He loses his ability to command the battle. He's out there wrestling with a German, and it's his subordinate who's in the center with the infantry. My name is Michael Taylor. I'm an associate professor of history at the University at Albany. I am an expert in ancient military history, particularly focused on the military history of the Roman Republic and the Roman army. Today we're going to look at ancient Rome battles in movies and TV shows and judge how real they are.
Those are Roman triremes.
So we have here a time travel scenario where Indiana Jones has been transported back to the siege of Syracuse in 212 BC, a plane flying over this siege where the Romans are trying to capture the Greek city of Syracuse during the Second Punic War. One thing that Indy gets wrong is Harrison Ford calls these ships triremes. At this point, the Romans are almost certainly deploying quinqueremes. A bigger ship has more rowers, more power, and as a result, more deck space, since you can actually put bigger catapults. So if you're doing a naval siege, which is an aspect of the siege of Syracuse, you're going to want quinqueremes. The sort of giant bolts penetrating the plane, that's not necessarily unrealistic. I would be very surprised if any Roman catapult or ballista could range as far as they're shown in that scene, trying to, shooting a plane out of the air. So famously, the Syracusan defense in the siege of Syracuse was overseen by Archimedes, the scientist and engineer. He also has set up or rigged up a series of cranes, and some of these cranes have a chain and a grappling hook. Archimedes' cranes are supposedly quite effective at swinging around, getting this grappling hook at the end of the chain onto a ship, and in some instances, capsizing the ship. That story, of course, also over time improved into the telling, including the fanciful notion that he rigged up a series of mirrors or reflective shields to set Roman ships on fire. That seems to be physically impossible. The whole scene is fanciful and doesn't strike me as terribly historical, so I give it a 3. A sling can actually be reasonably effective. You certainly can absolutely kill someone. The one downside is a shield or a shield wall, as those soldiers are making, is very likely going to repel those slings. So slings are used for skirmishing, but if you have a really disciplined infantry formation, you're not going to be able to break it apart just with slings and arrows. We do have at least one instance of one line throwing it followed by another line followed by another, so a kind of rolling volley. That is attested in our sources. In Hollywood films, they very rarely show the Romans hurling their javelins. Every Roman legionary carries 2 heavy javelins. They're called singular pilum, plural pila, and they are very, very lethal weapons. They have a long iron shank that goes through an enemy's shield. It keeps going to what's ever behind that shield. So a pilum volley is a really devastating event. Here they're fighting light infantry, but it's actually a way to even the odds when you're facing a lot of missile troops. You have things you can throw to make them run away. A testudo formation is just a very close, compact formation where not only are the shields in the front of the formation locked together, but the soldiers in the rear ranks lift their shields over their heads. The soldiers on their sides hold their shields to the sides, and basically it creates a kind of box-like formation protecting the soldiers as they move forward. It is primarily attested in sieges. The guys actually walking up on the testudo is also something that we hear of. It's a way of getting guys over a low wall, and is something that is even practiced in the amphitheater sometimes as a kind of show of military agility. I'm going to give it an 8. I liked an attempt to show how tactics might work. They again form a testudo there. But they don't need to. You form a testudo if there's some kind of overhead threat of missile weapons. There it seemed that actually might be a disadvantageous formation because as they kind of show, if you're in that dense formation and guys are coming at you, it's hard for you to use your own weapons against them. If I were a halfway sensible British warrior, I wouldn't jump on top of a Roman shield because I know that there's a gladius coming right behind it.
Close the circle! Close the circle! Tighten the circle!
So we do hear of a formation that you use when you are, unfortunately, like these Romans, surrounded by enemy, and it's called an orbis, basically a circle, as a formation that you use if you need to form a perimeter on all sides. So whether or not it looked exactly like that, obviously we can't say, but that is actually a real formation. When we hear of chariots getting taken out, the advice is send someone with a missile weapon, an archer or a slinger, or in this instance a guy with a pilum, and kill the driver. And then that disables the chariot. That's probably one reason why chariots do go away is it is easy to kind of, you kill one guy and then the whole system is sort of broken, whereas with the cavalrymen, you might kill one cavalryman, but there's others on those horses. Overall, this clip I think is pretty good. I'd be tempted to give it a 9. The sort of giant stone-throwing catapults, what the Romans might call an onager, because it kicks like a wild donkey, called an onager. These huge catapults would probably not be deployed in a field battle. The Romans might use catapults like that. You would use them in a siege scenario, because when you're fighting a battle, you want artillery that you can really easily reposition as your forces move across the battlefield. So the Romans do have field artillery that is tactical, can be used in a battle, but it's smaller. It can be carried on a cart. Flaming arrows might be used again in a siege scenario if you want to shoot them to light the roof of a tower on fire or light buildings, say behind a wall on fire. They don't do you any good in a pitched battle. If you hit a guy with an arrow, his problem is that he has an arrow sticking out of it, not that the shaft is on fire. Hollywood needs light, and flaming arrows provide that for the kind of spectacle of the scene. If you plan to advance over a battlefield, you don't necessarily want to set it on fire before your own forces move into it. In terms of what incendiary devices are available to the Romans, they have things like just putting charcoal in a pot, and then those burning embers sort of pop out when the pot breaks upon impact. They do seem to use a variety of petroleum products that might burn. One thing I would note, incendiary devices get really good in the Middle Ages, and the secret ingredient there is gunpowder. They don't have that in the ancient world, so all of their incendiary devices are a bit subpar. One thing that is inauthentic is Maximus leading the charge himself. Roman generals almost never charge with the cavalry. They tend to position themselves right in the center of the battle where they can kind of control things and have the maximum situational awareness. So for Maximus to charge with the cavalry, note that he loses his ability to command the battle. He's out there wrestling with a German, and it's his subordinate who's in the center with the infantry who's actually in the best position to actually exert any kind of command and control over that situation. Roman generals like to stay in the middle, and they usually stay with the infantry, in part also because the infantry tends to be the decisive point in Roman battle. The Romans basically do not use chariots in any kind of tactical way, aside from the ceremonial chariot, so there would have been no scythe chariots. I would say that is a decent formation, but if you're under any kind of cavalry attack or chariot attack, it seems one of the best things you can do is present a relatively dense massed formation that prevents any one or two people from getting picked off. I'd say I'd be inclined to give it around a 7. This is a very rare clip that actually attempts to show a legion maneuvering over a battlefield. In the triplex acies, the threefold battle lines that the Romans have, where their cohorts, their individual units, are arrayed in this kind of checkerboard formation. So the Romans don't like to form a single dense massed formation because that single dense massed formation can be brittle, it can be broken up by an obstacle. If it gets disordered, everything gets disordered. Each cohort fights somewhat independently of the other cohorts, and that actually gives the overall legion a lot of tactical flexibility on the battlefield. If I'm the Romans in the front rank and I see these guys rolling the fire logs, I'm just going to kill the guys rolling the fire logs, and then the problem is solved. Also, my guess is those logs are kept on fire because they've put a lot of gasoline on them. The ancients are not going to have any kind of incendiary materials as effective, which means probably the logs are just going to burn out as they're rolled forward. So the swords approximate the Roman gladius that is in use at this time. And one thing that is inauthentic is you do not use a gladius to sort of fence with the way they're fencing in this clip. But a gladius is always used with a scutum. The sword is too short and chunky to effectively parry with. Essentially, if you were confronting an opponent, you absorb and parry his blows with your scutum, and then you strike with your gladius. It's the scutum and the gladius are together a kind of weapon system. I would give this a 7. The classic legion moving across the field, I've got to say I've got a soft spot for it. Once everything degenerates into the scrum, it gets a lot worse. Chariot racing is particularly popular throughout the Roman Empire as a centerpiece of games that are put on. It's a dangerous profession. Maybe not quite as dangerous as being a gladiator, but it certainly is a very hazardous performance that you're putting on. Charioteers sometimes wear safety gear, but it's padded. It's specifically designed for what happens if I fall off this horse. We do know that they would carry some kind of knife to cut the reins. They could kind of bail out of their chariot before things truly spun out of control. Piracy at this point exists, but no pirate is going to be in a position to have a huge fleet and engage in a fleet-style action against the Roman Navy. These guys are going to be probably much more similar to the kind of Somali pirates that we've seen in the Red Sea. Fishermen who with boats or people who are sometimes merchants, sometimes raiders, but not with the military capacity of even trying to engage any kind of Roman force.
Ramming speed!
Yes, it's great to break their oars, but it's even better if you can just get your ram in the hull of their ship, and then that sinks it. We absolutely know that ships are sunk because of ramming. They found off the coast of Sicily a series of rams left over from a naval battle between the Romans and the Carthaginians. And where every ram is picked up off the seafloor, that's where a ship got rammed, sank to the bottom, the timbers rotted away, and now there's a ram on the floor of the Mediterranean. As much as the chariot scene is classic, the naval battle is just awful. So I'm going to say 5. Okay. So this is based on the Battle of the Teutoburger Wald. This took place in 9 AD and was an ambush by a Germanic confederacy of 3 Roman legions that were moving through the Teutoburg forest. It's one of the heaviest losses that the Romans suffer during the imperial period. 3 legions wiped out over the course of 3 days.
And this is the Roman army amid our forests and swamps.
So the Romans don't necessarily typically march in a huge square. Varus and his soldiers are vulnerable simply because they're moving over narrow more poorly developed roads in a forest, that's going to require them a relatively long snaking column, which those 3 legions were supposedly, yes, drawn out into. Soldiers fighting back-to-back here certainly would not be ideal. It's something you only do if you're caught sort of unprepared in an ambush. And the kind of formation that you might want to break into if there's Germans on all sides might be something like an Orbis formation or some kind of square perimeter. I'm going to give it an 8. The military equipment actually looks quite good. Lorica segmentata armor is actually first attested at this battlefield. It's the first time we've recovered it archaeologically. It's that kind of cool face mask we see the officer wearing also reflects a find that we found at the Calcresi site. I am not aware of any whistles being used. We certainly know that trumpets are used to, usually at a grander level, to signal troops to move in a certain way. Here probably the centurion's most effective sort of equipment is just going to be his own voice. Centurions are, I think, to use the cliche, they're the backbone of the Roman army. They are a very important officer in the Roman army. There's 60 centurions in each legion, and that means there's actually a lot of people who can control troops at a kind of very local level. So even if the general doesn't know what's going on, centurions can make decisions. Now, we do know that Caesar's army, which, like the army in Spartacus, usually fights in 3 lines. And one reason for doing that is if the people in the front line become exhausted, you can bring up cohorts from the rear ranks to replace them. Now, that being said, we do not have evidence of any kind of extremely coordinated system of rotating men within an individual century or cohort. That's something they've kind of made up. What the system that they show honestly seems clumsy and impractical to me. You don't want that many men cycling around a formation when you're trying to maintain its coherence and like the Gauls are rushing against you. We also do have a textual passage which describes a battle fought shortly after Caesar's death as part of the Roman Civil War that simply says men stayed in the front rank until they were killed and then they were replaced. So that probably is the simplest way to do it.
Get back in formation, you drunken fool!
Pullo and Varenus are based on actual centurions in Caesar's army who fight valiantly for Caesar in Gaul. Pullo in this series just portrayed as this total screw-up. The actual historical Pullo is a very, very effective centurion, just like Varenus, and is a professional military man. Some things that I like include the fact that all of the Roman soldiers are wearing mail armor. That is authentic. I do like the idea of Roman soldiers fighting in coherent formations. I'm going to give it an 8. The Romans are employing a type of heavily armored cavalry called Clebenarii or cataphracti. These are developed in the East. They're initially developed probably in Iran. But the Romans learn of their effectiveness and copy them. These are actually kind of the forerunners of in some ways, medieval knights. Most of these units are still in the East, but it's not impossible that you would have cataphracts fighting in the late Roman West with both heavy armor for the rider, heavy armor for the horses, and using a lance as kind of the primary weapon. Horse archers in general can be extremely accurate. The most accurate horse archers are going to be those who are raised usually on a kind of steppe or plains environment and kind of grow up doing horse archery. That's where the Romans will try to recruit their horse archers if they can. They can actually shoot, time their shot for when the, in between the horse's hooves hitting the ground, so they actually have a pause to take an accurate shot before the pump. This film imagines that Arthur is a late Roman commander, and he's given the same name as a historical Lucius Artorius Castus. He spent part of his career in Britain. He probably lived in either the 2nd or the 3rd century AD. Many hundreds of years before this film is set, I'm going to have to give it a 1. The simple fact that there are Romans in Britain in the 5th century is itself probably the most ridiculous thing.
Octavian's ships are so much faster than our Egyptian tubs.
The Battle of Actium is the last great battle of the civil war between Octavian, the adopted son of Julius Caesar, and Mark Antony, who had been one of Caesar's most loyal lieutenants. They soon come to blows, and at the Battle of Actium, Octavian beats Mark Antony. Mark Antony is allied with Cleopatra. Cleopatra has inherited the Ptolemaic fleet, and the Ptolemies have traditionally had a fleet of very, very heavy warships. That's actually one of the more accurate things they say in the film. Those ships are primarily designed, it seems, to do naval sieges, kind of like the siege of Syracuse we saw, where you want big ships that can have a lot of artillery pieces. This is one of the rare naval battles where it does seem that incendiary devices are useful, possibly because the smaller ships that Octavian are using, they're not going to be able to necessarily effectively ram all of Antony's big ships. Throwing javelins is not going to stop you from getting rammed. Now, it may prevent you from getting boarded. That could be a consideration of if you think that ship is coming alongside you to board you, you're going to want to try to kill as many soldiers on the deck of the enemy ship to prevent a boarding. Ironically, the one advantage of doing that is if they've successfully rammed you and your ship is stricken, you might try to get onto their boat and board them. There are some rams that are fitted above the waterline as kind of secondary rams, and those do tend to be a bit narrower. It seems the idea is to cause kind of secondary damage compared to the main ram. The sort of big pointy pencil-like rams above water, not super accurate, although again we do have some narrower above water rams. You don't do that with the Gladius. If you're boarding an enemy ship, you're going to have your scutum, and it's going to be messy and nasty and slippery and difficult. But you're gonna fight as best you can, protecting yourself with your shield, striking with your sword. I think this scene is just overall terrible. I'm going to give it a 2. I'm surprised to say, but my favorite scene in terms of military accuracy was from Risen. I thought Risen did the best job at actually showing kind of the range of actions that Roman soldiers can undertake. If you enjoyed this video, why not click on the next one?